London, England, December 1889. In the thick mists of London's East End, where factory chimneys spewed black smoke into a perpetually grey sky, stood a mansion that defied all architectural logic. The Blackmoor house, built in 1847 by the eccentric industrial tycoon Cornelius Blackmoor, had remained abandoned for over a decade after the mysterious disappearance of his entire family. It was an age when the Industrial Revolution had turned London into a metropolis of brutal contrasts, where Victorian opulence lived side by side with crushing poverty. Yet nothing in this city of contradictions prepared its inhabitants for what would happen on the night of December 15th, 1889, when 25 people entered Blackmoor House, lured by rumors of hidden treasures and supernatural phenomena. Only 3 would leave alive, and what they witnessed that night would forever change the history of terror in London. Their testimonies, documented by Scotland Yard but kept secret for decades, reveal a truth so disturbing it strains the limits of human reason. Blackmoor House was no ordinary mansion. Rising 4 stories high, with an architecture that seemed to mock the laws of physics, the structure loomed like a monstrous blend of dark red brick and grey stone on Whitechapel Road, right in the heart of London's most dangerous district. Its windows, arranged in seemingly random patterns, formed unsettling designs that hurt the eyes if stared at for too long. Cornelius Blackmoor was a man obsessed with the occult and the macabre. A magnate of the textile industry, he had amassed a considerable fortune during the first half of the century, but his wealth came shadowed by sinister rumors. Workers whispered of accidents that happened far too often, of machines that seemed to move with a will of their own, and of the owner himself appearing in the factories on the darkest nights, conducting experiments no one dared describe. Construction on his mansion began in 1847, but from the very first day, the laborers reported unsettling anomalies. Tools would vanish and reappear in impossible places. Architectural plans changed on their own during the night, and more than one worker swore they heard voices coming from within the walls as they built them. 5 men died during the construction in accidents the foreman claimed were impossible by the laws of nature. When the mansion was finally completed in 1850, Cornelius moved in with his wife Eleanor, a pale, silent woman rarely seen outside the property, and their 3 children, Marcus, aged 15, Isabella, 12, and little Edmund, barely 8 years old. Even in the violence and strangeness of the East End, the neighbors began to sense something was wrong with the Blackmoor residents. The children were never seen playing in the garden or walking the streets, as was common in those days. Eleanor Blackmoor only left the house to attend church on Sundays, always dressed entirely in black, moving as though burdened by an invisible weight. Merchants making deliveries to the mansion reported disturbing experiences. Hallways that seemed to stretch farther than was architecturally possible, rooms where the temperature would drop suddenly without explanation, and the constant feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. For 12 years, the Blackmoors' life appeared outwardly normal, until the spring of 1862, when the screaming began. The closest neighbors reported hearing terrifying cries from within the mansion at night, sounds they claimed were not entirely human. The screams would last for hours, blending with what seemed like rituals or chanting in unknown languages. Local Constable William Hartwell visited the property on several occasions after the complaints, but Cornelius always received him politely, insisting it was all part of scientific experiments conducted in his private laboratory. "Science requires sacrifices, Constable," he would say with a smile that never reached his eyes. "I'm working on discoveries that will revolutionize our understanding of life and death." By the summer of 1862, matters had grown worse. Merchants began refusing to deliver to Blackmoor House after several reported seeing figures moving in the 4th-floor windows, figures whose movements were not quite human. The local baker, Thomas Mitchell, swore he had seen through a 2nd-floor window what looked like an operating table, with something on it that had once been human, but no longer was. In August 1862, Eleanor Blackmoor stopped attending church. Her last public appearance was described by witnesses as deeply disturbing, She walked with rigid, jerking movements like a poorly handled marionette. And when Reverend Peterson greeted her after the service, she looked at him with eyes entirely white and whispered, "The dead do not rest in this house. The dead work." The Blackmoor children, too, began to change, in ways that terrified all who saw them. Marcus, who had grown into a young man of average height, suddenly seemed to have shrunk, moving with the stiffness of an arthritic old man. Isabella was seen only once, by the laundress, Mrs. Murphy, standing motionless in the back garden during a storm, eyes closed and wearing an unsettling smile as the rain poured down on her. The youngest, Edmund, vanished from sight for months, until the postman reported hearing the sound of children's laughter coming from the house's basement, laughter that went on for hours without pause. The final disappearance of the Blackmoor family took place on the night of October 31st, 1862. Neighbors reported strange lights moving through the house, as if dozens of people with candles were walking the corridors at once. That night, the screams were so relentless that several families temporarily abandoned their homes, unable to endure the noise. At dawn on November 1st, Blackmoor House had fallen into absolute silence. When the authorities finally entered 3 days later, they found the mansion empty, but with signs it had been inhabited until very recently. The beds were made. Fresh food still sat in the kitchen. Candles were still burning in several candelabras. But there was no trace of Cornelius, Eleanor, or the 3 children. The most disturbing discovery was in the basement, a fully equipped laboratory filled with apparatus that no scientist of the time could identify. Operating tables stained with substances that investigators refused to analyze. Walls covered with anatomical diagrams depicting human bodies connected to what appeared to be complex machines. At the center of the lab stood a circular table surrounded by chairs. On the table lay an open book, written in Latin, its first line so disturbing that no scholar dared translate it in full. For the next 27 years after the Blackmoors vanished, the mansion remained empty, but not dormant. The people of the East End developed a strange, uneasy relationship with the abandoned property. They feared it, yet could not ignore it. Every family within a 5-street radius had a story to tell about Blackmoor House, stories whispered on the darkest winter nights. Mrs. Agnes Hoare, who lived directly opposite, kept a meticulous diary of the anomalies she witnessed, a record that would later prove vital in understanding the events of 1889. She documented over 300 inexplicable incidents, lights that switched on and off in specific patterns, as if following a secret code, figures appearing in the 4th-floor windows always at exactly 3:33 a.m., figures that moved with repetitive gestures as though performing some sort of ceremony. The neighborhood children invented macabre games around the mansion, daring each other to touch the front door, to pick flowers from the overgrown garden, or to stare into the windows for 60 unbroken seconds. These games always ended badly. The children who accepted the challenges came back changed, plagued by nightmares for weeks, and with an unsettling habit of drawing the same strange symbols over and over again on any surface they could find. What finally lured the 25 victims to the house was an advertisement that appeared in the London Chronicle on December 10, 1889. The notice, never traced back to its original author, reads simply, "Brave individuals wanted for a nighttime exploration of a historic property. Great rewards await those who dare. Meet at Blackmoor House, Whitechapel Road, December 15th, midnight. Bring your own lantern." What made this advertisement irresistible to so many desperate Londoners was the rumor that accompanied it. Word spread in the East End's taverns that Cornelius Blackmoor had hidden a fortune in gold somewhere inside his mansion before his disappearance. It was said that his laboratory had become a kind of private bank, not only storing his personal wealth, but also treasures looted from Egyptian tombs and occult artifacts of immeasurable value. For the impoverished people of the East End, ground down by the brutal realities of the industrial age, the promise of wealth was enough to outweigh any fear of the supernatural. 25 people decided to risk their lives that night. Factory workers who hadn't eaten in days, prostitutes who saw a chance to escape the streets, professional thieves drawn by the challenge, and even a few members of the middle class who had lost their fortunes to bad investments. Among them was Thomas Kellaway, a 45-year-old former soldier who had served in the Afghan War and believed nothing on earth could frighten him more than the battlefield. There was also Sarah Pemberton, a 26-year-old widow with 3 young children to feed, James Morrison, an experienced thief who prided himself on having robbed the most secure homes in London, and Mary Catherine O'Sullivan, an Irish textile worker who had heard strange stories about Cornelius Blackmoor from those who had met the man themselves. The night of December 15th, 1889, was bitterly cold and damp, with a thick fog that turned the streets of London into spectral labyrinths. The 25 individuals arrived separately at Blackmoor House between 11:30 p.m. and midnight, each carrying their own oil lantern, just as the mysterious notice had instructed. What they found upon arrival disturbed them immediately. The mansion's front door, closed for the past 27 years, stood slightly ajar. A faint light glowed from within, though there was no electricity in the house, and no one had seen a caretaker enter or leave the property. More unsettling still was the sound that reached them from inside, not human voices, but something like the workings of ancient machinery, laced with whispers and languages none of them recognized. The 25 explorers entered Blackmoor House with the swagger of seasoned looters. That confidence unraveled within minutes. The interior defied every architectural law they knew. Hallways stretched far longer than the building's exterior could allow. Staircases led to floors that should not exist. Rooms changed size depending on the angle from which they were viewed. Thomas Kellaway, the war veteran who believed he had seen every horror the world could offer, was the first to notice that something was fundamentally wrong with the house's physics. In certain rooms, the flames of their lanterns burned downward instead of upward, as though gravity itself had been inverted. On the second floor, he discovered a library where the books were writing themselves, words appearing across the pages as he watched, forming Latin sentences that described necromantic rituals with scholarly precision. Sarah Pemberton, the young widow, broke away from the main group, following what she thought were the muffled sobs of small children. The sounds led her to the 4th floor, where she found the bedrooms of Cornelius Blackmoor's children, preserved exactly as they had been left in 1862. The beds were made, the toys neatly arranged, clothes hanging in the wardrobes, but the dolls and toy soldiers moved on their own, reenacting scenes of death and dismemberment with chilling accuracy. In those toys, Sarah recognized the faces of her own children, carved into porcelain and wood with impossible precision. The dolls turned their heads to look directly at her, their tiny mouths moving to whisper her children's names, describing in grotesque detail how each would die if she failed to escape the house before dawn. James Morrison, the seasoned thief, had made his way to the basement laboratory, guided by maps that had appeared, unbidden, on the walls. What he found there eclipsed his worst nightmares. The machines Cornelius had built still functioned after 27 years, powered by an energy he could not name. On the operating tables lay bodies that seemed alive, yet had clearly been dead for decades. They moved with the stiff precision of puppets manipulated by invisible strings. But the most horrifying sight was one of the corpses itself. It was his younger brother, missing from the streets of London for 10 years. The body opened its eyes, met his gaze, and spoke in a voice both familiar and utterly alien. "James, you've finally come. Master Blackmoor has been waiting for you. We have so much work to do together." Mary Catherine O'Sullivan, the Irish textile worker, had joined other members of the group on the 3rd floor, but quickly realized something had changed in them. They moved with unnatural precision, their gestures too perfect, too synchronized. Their conversations no longer sounded like conversations at all, but rehearsed lines from a script. And when they looked at her, their eyes reflected an intelligence that was not entirely human. One by one, the explorers began to vanish. First was William Chun, a Chinese merchant seeking business opportunities. He simply dissolved into the shadows as the others watched, as if the darkness had swallowed him whole. Next was Margaret Finch, an elderly woman who had lost her savings in a banking scam. One moment she was there, grumbling about the cold. The next, only her clothes remained, crumpled neatly on the floor, as though her body had been plucked out of them. The disappearances accelerated when the group reached the main dining room on the first floor. The table was set for 25, with fine porcelain plates and silver cutlery polished to a gleaming shine. At each place was a card bearing the name of one of the explorers, written in an elegant hand identical to the script found in Cornelius Blackmoor's documents. But the cards held more than just names. Each one contained intimate details of the guest's life, their darkest secrets, their hidden crimes, their deepest fears. Thomas Kelloway's card revealed that he had killed innocent civilians during the war, not in combat, but for pleasure. Sarah Pemberton's card detailed how she had poisoned her husband to collect his life insurance. James Morrison's listed every theft, every victim he had left wounded, every life ruined by his greed. As each explorer read their card, something changed in them. Their expressions went blank, their movements became mechanical. One by one, they sat down at the table like obedient guests at a macabre banquet. Then the chairs began to sink slowly into the floor, carrying their occupants down into the depths of the house, to the laboratory where Cornelius Blackmoor's eternal work continued. By midnight, only 3 explorers remained conscious and capable of resisting the mansion's supernatural pull. The other 22 had been consumed by a force that turned the living into components of experiments transcending death itself. The 3 survivors, Thomas Kelloway, Sarah Pemberton, and Mary Catherine O'Sullivan, were not saved at first by sheer willpower, but by a trait they unknowingly shared. Each had been marked by earlier encounters with the supernatural that had left them partially immune to the mansion's psychic manipulation. Kelloway had survived an attack in Afghanistan by forces locals claimed were possessed by jinn. Sarah had grown up in an Irish household where her grandmother practiced druidic protection rituals. Mary Catherine had worked in Cornelius Blackmoor's factories before his disappearance, where she had been exposed to occult energies that permanently altered her perception of reality. Realizing they were the only ones left, the 3 decided to descend into the basement to confront the source of the horror directly. What they found in Cornelius's laboratory exceeded the limits of human comprehension. The underground room had expanded impossibly, transforming into a vast cavern stretching far beyond the house's foundations. The machines Cornelius had built had evolved over 27 years, growing like living organisms that fused metal, flesh, and something belonging to no known realm of nature. At the center of this expanded laboratory stood Cornelius Blackmoor, no longer entirely human. His body had been augmented with mechanical components that pulsed with violet energy. His head had been replaced by a crystalline device that appeared to contain his brain, magnified and connected to dozens of cables snaking outward into the darkness. Around him, laid out on operating tables disappearing into the shadows, were the bodies of the 22 missing explorers. Yet they were not dead in the traditional sense. They had been integrated into Cornelius's most ambitious experiment, the creation of a collective mind that would transcend the limits of individual mortality. The bodies were linked by a network of tubes and wires carrying not only blood and electrical impulses, but also memories, emotions, and entire consciousnesses. The 22 no longer existed as separate people. They had become components of a higher intelligence that Cornelius controlled from his central position. When the 3 survivors entered the lab, Cornelius's voice did not emerge from his crystalline device. It came from the mouths of all the connected bodies at once. "Welcome, my final guests. You've arrived just in time to witness the birth of a new humanity." The collective creature born from the 25 explorers began to speak, each individual voice still recognizable, yet altered. Sarah heard her former companions describe the wonders they now experienced as part of the group mind. "We can feel every thought at once, Sarah. No more loneliness. No more fear. No more individual death." But the 3 could see the terrible truth behind this supposed transcendence. The bodies on the tables writhed in constant agony. Their faces were masks of eternal terror, and from time to time their mouths opened in silent screams, lips forming desperate pleas for release. Cornelius then revealed the true purpose of his experiments. It was not merely to create a collective mind, it was to use it as a beacon to attract entities from higher dimensions. The rituals he had performed over decades had torn rifts in reality, allowing alien consciousnesses to seep into the physical world. Blackmoor House was not just the laboratory of a madman, it was an interdimensional anchor point, a beachhead for incomprehensible creatures to establish themselves in earthly reality. The 22 explorers had been transformed into living receivers for these entities, their human minds serving as translators, so the alien beings could interact with the material world. The 3 survivors watched as the entities began to manifest physically, forms that defied Euclidean geometry, made of impossible angles and colors that did not exist in the normal visible spectrum. These beings spoke through the connected bodies, describing their plans to spread beyond Blackmoor House and turn all of London into an extension of their dimensional realm. The final battle was not physical, but mental. The survivors realized the only way to stop the invasion was to destroy the connections, stabilizing the interdimensional portal. Drawing on the knowledge gained from their past supernatural encounters, they began to recite counterspells and protective rituals while attempting to physically sever Cornelius's machines. The resistance was fierce. The interdimensional entities fought to keep their anchor point, using not only the connected bodies as soldiers but manifesting their power directly to assault the minds of the 3 intruders. Kellaway endured visions of every battle he had ever fought, simultaneously, memories of war magnified to the brink of madness. Sarah was forced to relive her husband's death again and again, each repetition more vivid and agonizing, as if the entities were extracting every drop of guilt buried in her subconscious. Mary Catherine was besieged by the voices of all the workers who had died in Cornelius's factories, accusing her of complicity for staying silent about the dangerous conditions. Yet their combined resistance caused enough disruption. One by one, the connections began to fail, releasing the captives from the collective mind. But freedom brought no salvation. After experiencing forced transcendence, returning to individual existence was psychologically catastrophic. The liberated bodies died instantly, their minds unable to function after what they had become. The collapse of Cornelius Blackmoor's experiment did not bring the ending the survivors had hoped for. It marked the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. As the final connections of the collective mind disintegrated, Blackmoor House shuddered like a living organism from which its heart had been ripped out. The walls began to weep a thick, black substance that smelled of copper, and something far more sinister, something none of the 3 could name, yet instinctively recognized as the scent of interdimensional death. Thomas Kellaway, Sarah Pemberton, and Mary Catherine Sullivan escaped the mansion just as the first light of dawn began to pierce through the London fog. But what they had witnessed in the depths of the laboratory had marked them in ways only time would reveal. They were no longer entirely human. They had been exposed to forces that had permanently altered their perception of reality and their place within the universe. They ran through the cobbled streets of the East End like souls fleeing hell itself. But they quickly realized they could never simply return to their old lives. Something had changed in them, something visible to anyone who looked too closely. Strangers stepped aside for no apparent reason. Animals bolted from their presence. Small children cried when they drew near. Kello was the first to try reporting the events to the authorities. He went straight to Scotland Yard, but his testimony was met first with skepticism, and then with alarm, not because of the story he told, but because of the way he told it. His voice carried strange harmonics, as if several people were speaking through his throat at once. At times he spoke words and languages he didn't know, and when asked what they meant, he seemed as startled as the investigators. Inspector Charles Whitman, a 20-year veteran of Scotland Yard, and no stranger to London's most bizarre crimes, documented Kello's account with care. But as he transcribed, he noticed unsettling patterns emerging. The details Kello gave about the interior architecture of Blackmoor House perfectly matched blueprints believed lost for decades. More disturbingly, he described Cornelius's experiments with a degree of medical precision, and using scientific terminology that no uneducated ex-soldier should have possessed. Consulting with members of the Royal Medical Society, Whitman learned that the procedures were, at least in theory, possible, but required anatomical knowledge not developed until very recently. Sarah Pemberton took a different approach. She returned to her small Whitechapel home and tried to resume her life, caring for her 3 young children. But it soon became clear something in her had irrevocably changed. The children who once ran to embrace her now hid at the sound of her footsteps. Her eldest, 7-year-old Timothy, told his grandmother, "Mum smells like the grave, and her eyes are looking at things that aren't there." Sarah had gained a disturbing gift, the ability to see and speak with the dead. Not just the recently departed, but generations of spirits trapped in the East End by violent deaths or traumatic ends. Her home filled with spectral visitors only she could perceive. She spent hours speaking with murdered prostitutes, factory workers, and children lost to disease. Neighbors grew uneasy when they heard her carrying on long conversations with no one. But what truly alarmed them was when she began sharing things the dead had told her. Intimate details of families who had lived there decades earlier, unsolved crimes, even occasional predictions of the future, based on whispers from beyond. Mary Catherine Sullivan experienced perhaps the strangest transformation of all. Her years in Cornelius's factories had exposed her to energies that now manifested as a form of involuntary precognition. She began to dream of events days, weeks, or even months before they happened, but they were never happy omens. Her visions were always of death, tragedy, and horror awaiting people she knew. She foresaw workplace accidents, the arrival of illnesses, even detailed nightmares of crimes yet to be committed. And the worst part, they always came to pass, exactly as she had dreamed them. Trying to warn people only branded her a madwoman in a community already too burdened with trouble to indulge superstition. The 3 survivors tried meeting in the weeks after their escape, but soon discovered that being together amplified their supernatural afflictions. When they gathered, the dead who followed Sarah became visible to everyone. Mary Catherine's visions grew so intense they became physically painful. The strange voices that spoke through Kello multiplied into a chaotic chorus of interdimensional entities. During one such meeting, in an abandoned riverside tavern near the Thames, they realized a horrible truth. They had never truly escaped Blackmoor House. They were still connected to Cornelius's experiment, functioning now as living antennas, broadcasting the influence of those otherworldly entities into the outside world. Everyone they came into contact with was subtly changed. Sarah's family began having nightmares of hooded figures whispering in unknown tongues. Kello's co-workers at odd jobs developed morbid fascinations with death and found themselves drawing strange symbols without knowing why. People who heard Mary Catherine's predictions discovered their own latent psychic abilities awakening, only in ways that terrified them. Scotland Yard eventually opened a secret investigation into the Blackmoor House incident, headed by Inspector Whitman. But the deeper he delved, the more he realized he was facing forces far beyond the reach of human law. Agents sent to collect evidence returned different. They reported experiences they couldn't put into words. The house itself seemed to be adapting, evolving. Those few who managed to enter and return described a structure no longer bound by the rules of architecture. The rooms shifted their layout between visits. New corridors appeared, leading to spaces that should not exist. And the machines in the basement laboratory had begun reconstructing themselves, using materials no scientist of the era could identify. The official reports from Scotland Yard, kept classified for more than a century, document phenomena that defied the scientific understanding of the Victorian age. Photographs taken inside the house revealed figures that hadn't been present when the images were captured. Audio recordings contained voices speaking in languages that even the most respected linguists of the time could not identify. Samples of the black substance that seeped from the walls refused to be analyzed, vanishing from laboratories overnight, leaving behind only stains that smelled of sulfur. Thomas Kellaway was the first to die, in March of 1890, barely 3 months after escaping the Blackmoor House. He was found in his rented room with an expression of absolute terror frozen on his face, but also a smile his neighbors described as not entirely human. On his nightstand lay a diary he had been filling obsessively, packed with technical diagrams for machines that would not be invented for decades. The final entries described conversations with entities claiming to be architects of alternate realities. These beings had told him that Earth was only one among millions of dimensions being prepared for a cosmic convergence, one that would allow higher consciousnesses to claim control over the physical universe. Cornelius's experiments, they said, had been merely the first step in a process that would ultimately transform all of reality into an extension of dimensional realms where natural laws functioned in entirely different ways. Sarah Pemberton survived until 1893, but the last years of her life were a gradual descent into a form of madness that was both illuminating and terrifying. She developed the ability to communicate not only with local dead, but with spirits from other eras and places. Her conversations became so complex that she required multiple notebooks to record the revelations she received. The spirits told her stories spanning centuries of hidden history. They revealed that the Blackmoor house was not the only interdimensional contact point on Earth. There were dozens of similar locations scattered across the globe, all connected by an energy network that allowed alien entities to coordinate their invasion efforts. They described ancient rituals performed by lost civilizations and experiments that had opened permanent rifts between dimensions long before Cornelius was born. Sarah documented these revelations with painstaking care, creating a library of occult knowledge that filled over 50 notebooks. But the weight of this knowledge gradually consumed her. Her final entries described visions of a future where the interdimensional entities had completed their invasion, transforming Earth into an extension of their realm, where the surviving humans existed only as biological components within incomprehensible cosmic machines. Mary Thierry Sullivan lived longer than the other two, finally dying in 1901. But her existence after the Blackmoor house could hardly be called a life. Her precognitive visions grew more intense year after year, until she spent more time experiencing probable futures than living in the present. She developed the ability to see multiple timelines at once, observing every possible way events might unfold. This multidimensional perspective on time made it almost impossible for her to function in normal society. When she spoke to people, she would answer questions they hadn't yet asked, refer to events years in the future as if they had already happened, and sometimes seemed to be holding conversations with the future versions of those standing before her. In her final years, Mary Thierry made a prediction that chilled anyone who heard it. She described a time, roughly a century in the future, when the descendants of Cornelius's experiments would resurface with far more advanced technology. She foretold that the dimensional rifts, partially sealed in 1889, would reopen during a period of great global unrest, allowing the interdimensional entities to complete the invasion Cornelius had begun. According to her visions, this new invasion would go unnoticed by most of humanity, for it would be carried out primarily through technological means that did not yet exist in 1890. The entities would use global communication devices to transmit frequencies that would subtly alter human consciousness, preparing the population for their eventual transformation into components of an interdimensional collective mind. Official records indicate that the Blackmoor house was finally demolished in 1895 after multiple construction crews refused to work on the property due to inexplicable working conditions. However, local witnesses reported that the demolition was strangely incomplete, even though workers claimed to have completely destroyed the structure. Photographs taken of the site in the days following showed parts of the house still standing, as if they were rebuilding themselves overnight. City records from London indicate that the land where Blackmoor House once stood was sold and rebuilt multiple times during the 20th century, but no structure erected on that site lasted more than a few years. Owners invariably reported inexplicable phenomena that forced them to abandon their properties. Mechanical voices emanating from the walls, electrical devices functioning in impossible ways, and the constant sensation of being watched by non-human intelligences. During World War II, the area was bombed by the German Luftwaffe. But local witnesses swore that the bombs which fell on the site of the old Blackmoor house exploded inward instead of outward, as if they were being absorbed by something underground. After the war, the British government classified the area as unsuitable for residential or commercial development, for reasons never publicly explained. In recent decades, independent researchers have begun connecting the events of the Blackmoor house to other similar incidents reported around the world. Scientific experiments ending in mass disappearances, houses where the laws of physics seem not to apply, individuals claiming to have been contacted by interdimensional entities seeking to establish anchor points in earthly reality. Digitized files from Scotland Yard, partially released in 2019 under Freedom of Information laws, revealed that the investigation into the Blackmoor house was never officially closed. It remains an active case, with specialized agents continuously monitoring the site and tracking any anomalous activity that might indicate Cornelius's experiments are resurfacing. Because the most terrifying truth about the Blackmoor house is not what happened in 1889, but what continues to happen. The 25 explorers who entered that night did not simply die. They were transformed into seeds of an interdimensional invasion that is still germinating. Their consciousnesses, altered by Cornelius's experiments, continued to exist in a state between life and death, serving as beacons guiding alien entities into our world. Every person who hears this story, every individual drawn to the mysteries of the Blackmoor house, is being subtly evaluated by forces operating beyond our comprehension. The interdimensional entities have learned patience. Instead of attempting another direct invasion, they have chosen a subtler approach, unfolding over generations. And if you are hearing these words, if you've reached the end of this account, you may already be part of their plan. Because the true lesson of the Blackmoor house is not that evil can be defeated, but that some victories are merely the beginning of far longer, far more complex battles. The question is not whether the entities of Cornelius Blackmoor will return. The question is whether they have already returned, operating through means so subtle we have not realized that the invasion began long ago, and that all of us may already be, unknowingly, components of a cosmic experiment reaching far beyond a single macabre house in London's East End.